BookTube, and welcome back to the library tour of Doom. This is a library tour of every book currently on my shelves, every book that ever has been on my shelves, and every book that's on my electronic shelves. All of this whole endless parade of books was Lord Ganesha's idea to toughen you up by giving you the ultimate library tour. And today, we are doing a book that would fall under the category of books that I don't currently own. Although not exactly, because even when I owned this book, I never owned it with the copy that I found online. I just thought it would be a fun thing to hold up in the video. And this is John Polidori's The Vampire. I've never seen it with this, Interview with the Vampire type cover. I assume that's the Tom Cruise movie is what is inspiring this thing. One way or another, I've had this book in a few different paperback editions, and once upon a time I could swear I had this in a rather pretty hardcover edition, even though it's not long at all. It's like fewer than 100 pages. This is a groundbreaking story in one sense, because it sort of brings the vampire, the whole mythology, the whole folklore of the vampire, into more or less the modern age. This was published in 1819, originally under Byron's name, Lord Byron's name, because this sprang from the same Lake Geneva drug-fueled storytelling session that gave us Frankenstein. And therefore, the ideological provenance of this book has been much debated. It's the story of a guy who meets a vampire. Lord Ruthven is an English aristocrat vampire. He is an aristocrat in the way that later Count Dracula would be, but he's not. Count Dracula is a bloated old tick of a thing when we first meet him. There's nothing in the sexual allure at all in the first meeting that Harker has with Dracula, and the basic pattern here is much the same as Bram Stoker's Dracula. In Bram Stoker's Dracula, Harker meets Dracula and then meets him again. Only he's different. He's changed. He's in a different environment, but he is back again, so to speak. And that happens in this book as well. The main character meets this vampire. They travel together. The vampire seems to die. Lord Ruthven seems to die, but then returns. He returns in extremely charged and fraught emotional terms. There's a race to stop a marriage. There's a race to save an innocent woman from becoming the new victim of a vampire, and it all fails. The race all fails. This is a little novella in which a weird kind of evil that doesn't see itself as evil wins, triumphs, and I reread this a couple of years ago. I forget what it was. I got an anthology of vampire stuff. Just one of those big, predictable vampire books. And to my delight, it had the whole text of of Polidori's The Vampire in it. So I reread it a few years ago. It is serviceable. It is almost impossible, I think, to read this story without having Dracula in your mind. Bram Stoker's Dracula is incredibly effective as a novel. This is nothing like that. And they're so similar in so many ways that it's impossible, I think, to read this without thinking of Bram Stoker's book. I guess that's not such a bad thing. It probably floats this book's boat just a bit. But I think it'd be more interesting to read. It's probably more interesting to read about this thing than to read the book itself. The book itself is a little bit labored going. It's only when you finish it and step back and think, okay, what just happened in this story, that you suddenly are interested. Because what happens in the story is it's a slap in the face to Georgian storytelling norms and to early Victorian storytelling norms. It's very interesting in that sense. I don't want to spoil too much of the book, but it's everything in the main actions of the plot, the two parts of the plot that you think will happen doesn't happen. And that in itself is interesting. And Polidori was an interesting figure. I keep waiting for him to get a gigantic biography. He hasn't had one from a popular press in America in probably about 40 years, I would think. Uh, but inevitably, when such a biography happens, it will talk about this book quite a bit, especially the controversy, because originally this was published under Byron's name, then the publisher withdrew that name because both Byron and Polidori came forward and said, no, this is Polidori's book. It's not mine. It's understandable why the publisher would put Byron's name on it, since if you put Byron's name on a recipe book for wheat cereal, it would have sold like crazy. So it's understandable, especially since, ascribing for the moment morally neutral motives, the publisher might have thought, well, Byron was certainly involved in the origin of this book, so maybe it's not that fraudulent to put his name on it. Polidori continually elaborated throughout the rest of his life that although Byron came up with the idea, Polidori is the one who fleshed it out and wrote it out, and that Byron would never have done that. And Byron seconded that. Absolutely seconded that. Said that this is Polidori's book, not mine. But I don't think that The Vampire by John Polidori would exist in any way if not for Lord Byron, which can't be said of Polidori's other books. So I don't know. We don't really have a category in books for written by and inspired by. But I think it's not really possible to overestimate the importance of Byron in the genesis of this book, especially since, in addition to all that, in addition to how much he talked during those drug-fueled days, and maybe how many details of the plot he got into that Polidori just wrote down, in addition to all of that, in very strange ways, it's a very Byronic story, and not like anything else that Polidori wrote. I guess you could explain that by saying just what we've already said, that Byron inspired it in great detail, inspired it atmospherically, personally, everything else about it. I guess we can go with that. I certainly am not going to rock the boat, but it reads like something that Byron would write. Not just think up, but write. In a way, it doesn't have Byron's linguistic virtuosity. And maybe that's the dead set, detail against it, is that it doesn't have that. It's clearly not written word for word, line by line by Byron. I think it's fascinating. That's all. I've often advocated in my earlier salad days. I often advocated that when this thing is reprinted, it should always have dual authorship, not written by and inspired by, but just written by a collaboration between John Polidori and Lord Byron. But one way or another, I've never had it with this cover, and I don't have it now. I checked before I made this video, and even in the vampire lore anthologies, I have a couple of big books of vampires. Even there, it does not appear to be there. And if Penguin Classics ever did a standalone edition of the Vampire, I have never seen it. And it can't be because it's so small, because they do standalone editions of very short works as short as this. So maybe I'm just missing a Penguin Classic, or I can't believe that they wouldn't do it. Somewhere out there, somebody has written the great introductory essay for this thing. But I think Oxford World Classics did this as a standalone volume. One way or another, I don't have any of them. The Brattle Bookshop here in Boston will provide, sooner or later, paperback of The Vampire will crop up. And maybe I will pass it by. Maybe what I really want is a big fat vampire literature anthology that has this in it. That's probably the route I'll go, is just to wait for something like that. And who knows, maybe I have one of those anthologies and I've just overlooked this book in it. I would be a fairly big entry in the table of contents, but one way or another, if I have such a vampire literature anthology, we will find it on this library tour, because we are doing everything. The only reason I was hesitating here is because that is not a book I have in my library or ever have had. And I am not going to use this as a precedent to start introducing books that just look interesting to me. New. I have had a copy of The Vampire in my collection a couple of times, and a cursory search online did not turn up the covers of the copies that I've had, so I chose this one instead. But that's your book for today. It's John Polidori's The Vampire, which I recommend. It is a very energetic reading experience, and it won't take you any time at all. One quick evening, and you'll be done. And then you'll see what I mean. If you haven't read it, you'll see what I mean about how off-kilter it is in a lot of ways, especially morally. But anyway, that's your book for today. It's a Friday, so once again, I may hold back on the Library Tour of Doom until Monday, but I may not either. So we shall see. I will wrap this up for now, and we'll find out what happens tomorrow. Thank you, BookTube.